Hearing will come to order. As this hearing is virtual, we must address a few housekeeping matters. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise or vertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting yourselves. If I notice you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, the staff will unmute your microphone. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there's a technology issue, we will move on to the next member until the issue was resolved, and you will retain the balance of your precious time. You will notice a clock in your screen that will show you how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn to yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members that your time has almost expired. When your time is expired, the clock will turn red, and I will recognize the next member. In terms of the speaking order, we will follow the order set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member. Then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority, and finally, members not present at the time the hearing is called to order. I will deviate from that if the ranking member has someone who needs to move up or adjust, as I will within our ranks at the same time. Finally, House rules require to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send items they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided to you in advance. This morning, we welcome 4 individuals with expertise in broadband. Matt Dunn of the Center on Rural Innovation, Max Steyer of the Partnership for Public Service, Ms. Joy Cheney from the National Urban League, and Mr. Lang Zimmerman of Yellcat Communications. They are here today to discuss one of the most important issues of our time, ensuring that all Americans have the connection to fully participate in our economy and society. Broadband has been an enormous benefit to our country. It's a key driver of our economic growth and innovation, has democratized access to educational resources and new job opportunities, and has broadened availability of healthcare and social services. But during COVID, broadband became much more than that. It became a matter of literally life and death. People with reliable broadband at home were more easily able to socially distance by transitioning to telecommuting and remote learning. They could use video conferencing to keep in touch with friends and family, access healthcare services, order essential supplies and medicines, and use government services. In other words, the pandemic has made it abundantly clear that access to reliable broadband is not a luxury, but a necessity. Broadband is as important to modern life as electricity or running water. Unfortunately, not everyone is so fortunate. Many of our rural communities have no connectivity or remain reliant on outdated technologies that don't provide sufficient bandwidth. Communities of color have also been disproportionately affected. It has limited access to jobs, left many students of color struggling to keep up with their schoolwork, and put many people of color at higher risk of catching the virus. As the subcommittee that oversees the Federal Communications Commission, we have been working on this issue for years, and we ramped up our efforts during the pandemic. We helped secure billions in funding to provide devices and connectivity for at-home learning and telemedicine. We have provided substantial resources for better broadband maps and given states the flexibility to use virus relief funds on broadband. And we are excited that just last week, the FCC launched the Emergency Broadband Benefit, a $3.2 billion program to provide discounted broadband services and devices to low-income Americans, including people affected by the pandemic. These efforts are just the beginning. There is bipartisan agreement about the importance of ensuring universal broadband access, and the administration has made it clear that broadband is one of the main priorities in an infrastructure package. Today, we will learn more about how the lack of broadband affects rural communities, the connectivity issues facing communities of color, and the challenges of small internet providers. And we hear about an issue dear to me and my fellow appropriators, how broadband might make the federal government more efficient and effective. These insights will help ensure that we fully incorporate lessons from the pandemic into our infrastructure discussions and ensure we get the most value for each dollar we invest. I look forward to the discussion. Before I turn to each of the witnesses for their statements, I would like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Womack, our friend, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this very important hearing on truly bipartisan topic, broadband. When the pandemic began, as the chairman so stipulated, our businesses and schools closed. Many Americans began to work from home, increased their online purchases, and school classrooms became virtual. Our nation's broadband providers stepped up to the challenge to meet the increase in demand on our information networks. According to the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, the jump in demand had seen peak traffic roughly 20 to 30% higher than before the pandemic. Thankfully, the increase in broadband traffic was within the anticipated growth in demand operators could already accommodate. As such, U.S. broadband networks were able to accommodate these changes with virtually no drop in performance. The facilities-based competition model in the U.S. relies on to incentivize providers to invest in infrastructure past the COVID-19 network stress test, performing better than internet infrastructure in many other countries. The dynamic broadband competition in the U.S. has driven billions of dollars into network capacity that met the surge in demand. The light touch regulatory approach also allowed for network operators to flexibly adjust interconnection levels to meet new changes in demand. While the pandemic showed the strength of our nation's broadband networks, it also highlighted that more work needs to be done to provide reliable and accessible internet service to many rural and urban areas. In America, your employment opportunities and education should not be limited by your ability to access the internet. I'd like to welcome our witnesses today. I look forward to hearing your ideas on improving broadband accessibility. Specifically, let me recognize Lang Zimmerman, the Vice President of Yellcat Telephone Company and Mountain View Telephone Company, which provides broadband service to northern Arkansas, including parts of my district. During the pandemic, Yellcat and Mountain View demonstrated their commitment to the communities by ensuring struggling customers remain connected to broadband services and connecting new customers to broadband. I'm pleased that he's with us today to provide the perspective on a service provider who's been working to expand broadband accessibility in rural Arkansas, actually boots on the ground. Currently, the federal government has dedicated tens of billions of dollars to broadband and 5G expansion through the Universal Service Fund, the various COVID relief bills, and the Department of Agriculture. We would like to hear if these resources are improving accessibility, if more funding is going to be needed, and that there are regulatory changes that could speed expansion and reduce costs. I want to thank the witnesses for participating today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Womack. Our first witness is Matt Dunn, founder and executive director of the Center on Rural Innovation. Please go ahead.
Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Matt Dunn, and I am the founder and executive director of the Center on Rural Innovation, a nonprofit action tank that was founded in 2017 to close the rural opportunity gap. Today, we are working with small towns across 20 states, including rural Tennessee, Wisconsin, Utah, Arkansas, and Nevada, to help them become successful in economic development and entrepreneurship in the 21st century. The rural-urban divide that's emerged since the Great Recession was driven by automation and a decline in entrepreneurship. As of January of 2020, less than half of all rural counties had returned to their pre-recession economies, and COVID-19 only knocked these counties to new lows. Specifically driving the divide is the fact that high-paying, resilient digital economy jobs like computer programmers, cybersecurity analysts, and IT specialists are not distributed equitably across the country. Rural America represents 15% of the nation's workforce, but only 5% of the digital economy jobs. As you can imagine, central to closing this gap is accelerating access to world-class broadband in rural America. And we help that by providing support to communities, policymakers, and others seeking to build future-proof broadband infrastructure. And as the past year has shown us, this work has never been more important. Broadband is no longer a luxury. It is a necessary piece of infrastructure to ensure there is equal access to healthcare, education, and jobs. And COVID has created a moment where there is the motivation and momentum to close the broadband gap. We need to take a lesson from the rural electrification effort a century ago and do this right. If we do not focus on delivering future-proof broadband, we will be back here 5 years and billions of dollars later discussing once again the inequity in broadband connectivity. Even before the pandemic, rural America struggled with a broadband gap. There is a small town near our headquarters that has a fantastic library. You drive by on Sundays and the parking lot would be full, which wouldn't be so odd if the library wasn't closed on Sundays. That parking lot was full of people working on their homework or their day jobs from their cars, making the most of the Wi-Fi leaking from the library windows. This story was no longer funny once COVID hit. The pandemic laid bare the depth and severity of the digital divide. More than 20% of rural Americans don't have access to broadband, a figure that's even worse for communities of color. It is estimated that 46% of rural Black residents don't have broadband access at home. During the pandemic, millions of children couldn't participate in remote school. Superintendents reported losing touch completely with many of their at-risk students. People who could work remotely would sit in running cars trying to use hotspots hastily put up by schools or police stations. Seniors unable to access new telehealth technologies due to poor broadband were forced to risk infection to visit clinics for routine checkups. However, this wasn't the case in every rural community. The small towns that had capitalized on municipal electric companies, co-ops, public-private partnerships, or collaborated with small telephone providers to build out future-proof fiber broadband had different experiences during the pandemic. These places benefited from city dwellers who brought their jobs with them to beautiful rural settings, reversing the population declines of the last decade. Powered by great broadband, tech startups and communities we work with have grown, received investment, and found new markets without needing to leave the places they love. We all know there are models to deliver sustainable world-class broadband to small-town America. We've seen the power of unleashing rural innovation in education and economic development when broadband is available. I wanted to offer 6 recommendations for this once-in-a-lifetime moment to ensure we build future-proof broadband in the most efficient way possible. 1, require ISPs to provide the FCC with accurate and validated data, no excuses. 2, focused on fast responses with hotspots and some wireless, but then focus most of the resources and money on fiber to the home. 3, predicate federal broadband funding on states allowing municipal, co-op, and public-private broadband solutions. 4, resist the temptation of reverse auctions and have funding follow plans such as USDA Reconnect that are driven by states and regions. 5, invest in programs to build the 250,000 person labor force needed for broadband deployment. 6, create enforcement mechanisms that hold providers who receive funding accountable. Thank you for your time and consideration of this important issue. You have the momentum and historic opportunity to bring broadband to all Americans once and for all. Rural America is ready to make this happen, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Our next witness is Max Steyer, President and CEO of the Partnership for Public Service.
It would help if I turn my mic on here. So I just want to start by saying thank you so much, Chairman Quigley and Ranking Member Womack, for inviting me to testify. As you mentioned, I'm the president of the Partnership for Public Service, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization focused on trying to make the federal government work better. It's terrific that you are having this hearing on the need for universal broadband. High-speed internet access is not itself the end, but an essential tool for Americans to thrive in today's world, as you said, like water, electricity. I will try to offer some context on why this matters so much right now, and 5 recommendations on the path forward. So as more services move online, the federal government needs to address the digital divide to ensure everyone has access to its critical services. Many people who rely on government do not have high-speed internet, such as more than 41% of Medicare beneficiaries, 35% of the population on rural tribal lands, 42% of rural veterans, and 60% of U.S. farmers and ranchers do not believe they have adequate internet connectivity. We need a government that is in fact even more digital. A government that serves the public using modern online tools is going to be more effective, efficient, user-friendly, and secure. So some examples on this. On the efficiency side, it costs the IRS $41 to field every phone call it gets, as opposed to pennies for online transactions. Second, providing an online option to report a lost or stolen passport resulted in a 46% increase in reporting, helping the State Department ensure that security of its passports. And a third example, a mobile app increased the accuracy and frequency of wage information reported to the Social Security Administration, which meant that it was able to reduce improper payments. Now, the pandemic supercharged the need for government to serve the public through modern online interactions. Many agencies rose to the challenge. Again, a couple of examples. The Veteran Health Administration delivered 1,000% increase in video healthcare visits. The USDA adopted new digital tools for electronic signatures and online file sharing for farm loans. Which leads me now to my 5 recommendations. First, we need to enhance the efficiency of government through collaboration across agencies to address the digital divide. The digital divide is a complex challenge that no one agency can solve. We heard already where lots of agencies are involved in funding. So some options include creating a cross-agency council. One existed during the Obama years, the Broadband Opportunity Council. Or a second opportunity would be to work with OMB, which is truly the center of government and a vital actor in bringing together the different pieces, the connectivity across government. Second, we need to leverage public-private partnerships. And again, an example here, the Veterans Health Administration has a partnership with Microsoft and internet providers to bring high-speed internet to rural veterans. Third, we need to improve the customer experience. Access alone is not enough. Services need to be easy to use even for those with low digital literacy, and agencies need to consider people who not only lack high-speed internet, but want other options. So the VA, for example, sent internet-enabled tablets to veterans, and customers should have choices. For example, the ability to call, to speak to someone, even if there is an option for doing something online. Fourth, and very important from our perspective, we need to give the federal workforce the tools and flexibility they need to serve the public effectively. The pandemic has revealed digital gaps in government itself, and we need to see more investment in modern IT systems, including secure, cloud-based environments. And we need the government to build off of what it's learned through the pandemic to continue to enable a lot of remote work so that it can actually access the best-in-class talent across the entire country and enable them to continue to work remotely. Fifth, and finally, we need actually agencies to regularly collect and report on data around access, use, and satisfaction with services. There are 2 specific pieces of legislation to mention here. Congress should pass the FACE Act, which will streamline the process for collecting customer feedback and require publicly reported customer service measures across agencies. And then second, ensure the implementation of the 21st Century IDEA Act, which sets usability standards for federal websites. We need OMB to put out the implementing regulations. Thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to the conversation after the rest of the witnesses.
Thank you. Now we will hear from Joy Cheney, Executive Director of the Washington Bureau and Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at the National Urban League.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Subcommittee Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Womack, members of the subcommittee, and in their absence, Full Committee Chairwoman DeLauro, Ranking Member Granger, thank you for having this hearing and for the opportunity to present the views of the National Urban League. As you said, my name is Joy Cheney, and I serve as Senior Vice President of Policy and Advocacy and Executive Director of the Washington Bureau of the Urban League. I bring you greetings on behalf of Mark Morial, our President and CEO. I am honored to testify about the need for universal broadband and how we can leverage the lessons learned by the COVID-19 pandemic for a more inclusive and 21st century society. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, many individuals, families, and children relied on their schools, places of work, and other quote unquote third spaces like libraries, churches, internet cafes, and coffee shops to connect to the internet because they did not have a broadband internet connection in the home. With a disproportionate number of these Americans being from communities of color or low income communities. Overnight, third spaces disappeared at a time when we needed connection the most. The pandemic accelerated the ongoing migration to remote everything, particularly for essential activities such as employment, healthcare, and education. The benefits of being connected grew even faster, but so did the costs to communities who were not connected. The COVID-19 pandemic proved that broadband was no longer a nicety. It had become a necessity, as you've said, Mr. Chairman, as necessary as electricity and running water. Far beyond the quote unquote homework gap, when schools were forced to close abruptly, districts that had the resources to provide computers and hotspots to students and educators were able to transition to online learning fairly quickly. But those who did not were left scrambling. Philadelphia Public School initially decided not to provide remote learning instruction, citing inequity in access to computers and high-speed internet is the main reason. And that's just an example. In healthcare, we know that the lack of broadband access is leading to inequality in obtaining the COVID-19 vaccine, yes, but that telehealth has become a critical necessity since the start of the pandemic. Some estimates show that healthcare providers are seeing 50 to 175 times more patients using telehealth than they did immediately before the pandemic. We don't simply expect this trend to reverse post-pandemic because of the benefits telehealth provides to those who could not easily visit a doctor in person. Nevertheless, telehealth is out of reach for those Americans without in-home broadband and or a proper device. And while these examples focus on those who cannot afford or do not have available broadband service on demand in the home, there are those who could have it, but who lack the digital literacy to use internet services, including a disproportionate number of older Americans. Moreover, even if you have broadband and you know how to use it, we need our public institutions to improve utilization. The costs of not doing so are borne disproportionately by those who rely most on government services, often at their time of need. In my home state of Florida, hundreds of Floridians risked their safety to line up during a pandemic to obtain an unemployment form because the state's website crashed, making it painfully obvious that the public sector is still far behind where it should be in terms of providing services over the internet. These examples underscore the need for universal broadband and the need for overdue investments towards closing the digital divide as a matter of civil rights and as a matter of human rights. It is also why the Urban League released our comprehensive Lewis Latimer plan for digital equity and inclusion. The plan describes and offers solutions for closing several gaps. We focus on expanding availability, ensuring affordability, lowering barriers to adoption, improving utilization, and extending access to economic opportunity for communities of color. One thing in this moment that would put us a long way towards addressing these gaps is to build on the work of the ongoing emergency broadband benefit and establish a long-term or permanent broadband benefit program. Any such program must set minimum standards that will regularly be reevaluated and adjusted to remain current. And we must ensure greater accountability from internet service providers. Moreover, to fund this, we know that costs cannot fall only on the American taxpayer. We need appropriations, especially in the beginning, so that the neediest in our society won't have to wait. But ultimately, we also need the industry to put skin in the game. One idea is a digital equity fund that could be the repository of contributions, including from spectrum auction proceeds. But whatever you as Congress does, the National Urban League charges you with doing something to ensure those who receive emergency broadband now don't go back to not having it once the emergency is over. Because as bad as the former gaps were, the gaps will only be much larger in the future. The COVID-19 pandemic has forever changed the way we will work, learn, and connect with others in society. If we do not close the digital divide, our communities will continue to fall behind at the speed of each innovation, and with them, our nation in the global marketplace. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you so much. Our fourth witness, a final witness, is Lang Zimmerman, Vice President of Yellcat Communications. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify about lessons learned from providing broadband during the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Lang Zimmerman. I'm Vice President of Yellcat Telephone Company and Mountain View Telephone Company. We're a small rural broadband and voice provider located in north central Arkansas. And my remarks today are on behalf of those two companies, as well as NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association, which represents about 850 small rural telecom carriers in 45 states. The pandemic has altered society as we know it and highlighted the importance of access to reliable high-speed broadband connectivity. I'm proud to report that as offices and schools closed over a year ago in response to the pandemic, Yellcat and Mountain View joined hundreds of other small broadband providers in making every effort to connect and keep connected everyone in our rural communities who wanted and needed high-speed broadband. If I had to identify one lesson learned from the pandemic, it would be that investments in broadband infrastructure and affordability are essential to everyone, to giving everyone, so that everyone will experience the telehealth, telework, and distance learning and other benefits of such connectivity. And how do we move forward from here? Nearly 70% of NTCA member customers are already connected to fiber broadband and can access speeds of 100 megabits or more. While we're proud of this work that has been done, the job is obviously not finished. Too many Americans are still waiting for reliable broadband service, many of whom are not served by community-based broadband providers. Those who lack access probably live in a rural area that provides no business case for deploying and maintaining an advanced telecom network. The USF High Cost Program will remain essential to incentivizing deployment in these areas and to help keep rates more affordable. But USF alone is not enough because it does not pay for the network construction. It does not provide capital to build networks. Congress has already appropriated considerable sums to the USDA Reconnect program to help connect unserved areas, and Yellcat and Mountain View each are working toward completion of fiber broadband deployment projects, thanks in part to Reconnect awards. But additional support from the government is needed to help finance the deployment of networks and provide the business case to operate them on an ongoing basis. Thankfully, both the administration and Congress have acknowledged that broadband should be an essential component of any major infrastructure plan. And as work continues toward an agreement, several key objectives should be kept in mind. First, broadband is essential and consumer bandwidth demands are increasing at a staggering pace. So why not support the most robust and reliable infrastructure? It is time to put resources toward more fiber broadband connections that can be readily upgraded to meet future demand and relied on regardless of terrain or weather conditions. Number two, at the same time, new investments must be coordinated with existing networks and ongoing deployments instead of backing a second network in an area where there is not a business case for even one network. This will be helped by prioritizing areas most lacking in broadband and putting at least some new infrastructure dollars through current programs such as Reconnect, which has been highly effective with a record of accountability and results. Number three, support should go to broadband providers with proven track records in delivering measurable real-world results. Four, we should look local and leverage the expertise and experience of community-based providers like Yellcat and Mountain View, regardless of their corporate form, when it comes to implementing broadband solutions. Cost is not the only barrier to broadband deployment. Carriers must secure approvals to cross government and privately owned lands. And the process for doing so can be very time-consuming and expensive, further delaying broadband installations that customers badly need. The standardization of permitting procedures across federal agencies should be a high priority, and Congress should also allocate the resources needed to timely complete reviews and establish reasonable but firm timelines for doing so. In addition, Congress should monitor supply chains and ensure agencies work closely with suppliers, as already considerable delays in order fulfillment for critical communications equipment could become increasingly problematic as more funds flow for deployment. Finally, broadband must be both available and affordable for the customer. Yellcat and Mountain View are pleased to be participating in the new Emergency Broadband Benefit Program to ensure that service is affordable for all. I encourage Congress to take the lessons learned from the EBB and apply them to a permanent broadband affordability program with predictable and sufficient funding. And I thank the subcommittee for holding this hearing and for your interest in determining the most effective ways to ensure everyone gets and stays connected to broadband. And we at my companies and NTCA companies are eager to work with you and will answer any questions.
Affordability is a concern for my constituents in Detroit. My question is, do you have any recommendations of how to address the affordability specifically for cities with high poverty rates? And any of the panel can answer.
I'll take a shot at that. The emergency broadband benefit program that is starting right now, it has funds that are only supposed to last an estimated 6 months. And that won't do anybody any good to get on and then get kicked off after 6 months. I think what it can do, though, is show the demand. I understand the website for people to try to sign up for the EBB has crashed because of demand. There's obviously a demand for it. What we need to do is learn from that and make sure that we can maybe extend that or make it permanent. There's currently a lifeline program for voice communications that is accessible for both landline and cell phone, and broadband, it probably needs a lifeline program of its own.
This is Joy Cheney from the Urban League, Congresswoman. And I'm not sure if you're still there, but I wanted to jump in to say I agree. We need some kind of long-term broadband benefit.
Yes.
And I addressed that in my testimony as well. If you look at my longer testimony or our Latimer plan, we also come up with an alternative. I don't think it's as good as the long-term broadband benefit, but we came up with some lifeline adjustments for mobile and broadband around health, education, and workforce that could also be an alternative and a solution. But I think the point is that we're all saying, I think on a bipartisan level, is that we must have funds that are allocated for those who simply do not have the resources, really almost at any amount, any low cost program to meet the needs of having broadband in the home. We need to have a broadband benefit program through FCC.
Congresswoman, if I could add just two additional points to the excellent comments that were just made.
Yes.
The two things is states who coordinated their efforts to try to help bulk purchase subsidies and be able to work in a coordinated way with social service agencies and others to deliver those, so that you took the friction out of someone having to figure out how to access the subsidy, how to then utilize it, have it apply either retrospectively or prospectively, because they were all different. Saw a lot faster utilization and allowed for people to take advantage of the subsidies that were available either from individual providers or that were available through state and federal subsidy. And it's worth considering that coordination. The other piece that I would mention is that we've recommended.
If I could just interject. In the city of Detroit, we have Connect 313. It's a citywide data-driven data inclusion strategy that brings organizations together to make Detroit a national model for digital inclusion and ensure all Detroiters can access the digital. What can we do in Congress to support this inclusion efforts at the local level? And with that, if you answer the question, and Mr. Chair, I'll yield back after their answers. You can continue, sir.
Thank you. Just the other thing that I would suggest, and there's been talk of this, is the idea of leveraging national service to be able to help support the kinds of efforts that it sounds like Detroit is taking a leadership role in coordinating. The opportunity for a broadband core that is focused on making sure that people are aware of subsidies, understand how to sign up, and also how, if they avail themselves of broadband services, they can save money in other parts of their life work is really powerful. The Urban League has done an excellent job of laying out the kinds of things that need to happen. And I think there's a moment for national service through an AmeriCorps program specifically on broadband support that could be powerful. And we've recommended that to a couple of states over the last year.
Thanks so much, Matt. I was going to say, yes, we certainly endorse some kind of digital navigators program that would help people not only learn how to get online and to get the access of whatever resources are available to them, federal or local, but then also learning how to get on, how to use, and how to really benefit from the internet. Thanks.
Thank you. And we're going to have to move on to the next question, or we'll get back to if there's anything left within the question asked, just to make sure that we have several that are on tighter deadlines. And toward that, and I believe that the ranking member wants me to recognize Mr. Joyce first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Womack, for conceding to me. Over the last year, Americans have relied more on services which allow them to connect remotely than ever before. Unfortunately, far too many Buckeyes in rural areas completely lack access to adequate broadband services. A 2019 study funded by the Appalachian Regional Commission across 8 Ohio counties found that in rural areas with 20 or fewer households per square mile, 80 to 90% of the households have no access to broadband whatsoever. We know that strong public-private partnerships will be critical to building out broadband infrastructure for these currently underserved communities. Mr. Zimmerman, given your experience in getting private operators to work with local stakeholders, can you provide any insight into what kind of practices have worked, and just as important, which practices have not worked in forming strong public-private partnerships to deploy broadband to underserved or unserved areas?
Yes, Arkansas had used a large chunk of its CARES money to do a broadband grant program, and that grant program was driven by community involvement, as in, if it was a municipality, the mayor had to sign off on the application, or if it was a county, the county judge had to sign off, and if it was both of those guys, they both signed off on it. So that was very effective in getting some areas involved and seeking out this money that was there, because sometimes, as you know, sometimes mayors are very progressive and know about these programs. Sometimes mayors or county judges do not know, and with the public-private partnerships, we were able to approach some areas that we knew were underserved and encourage them to apply with us. And so I think Arkansas set aside $125 million and went through it fairly quickly with some really good projects in the state of Arkansas. So I would encourage Ohio to look at some grant programs to take some of this broadband money, or if it's infrastructure money, they're calling it, you can still apply it to broadband in Ohio.
Well, there are several well-known factors that might diminish a broadband provider's willingness to invest in new infrastructure in communities which don't have sufficient access. These factors include low population density, challenging natural features of the land, and burdensome government regulations. Mr. Zimmerman, are there any other factors which policymakers should be aware of that limit broadband investments in unserved areas?
Well, yes. Some of the things that can make it tough on companies to develop. We sometimes have to get permits from federal agencies to cross their land. And in fact, on a couple of projects, one in particular, we made a conscious decision to bypass a federal piece of property that would have been a faster route, just because we didn't want to get bogged down in the process. So what we would encourage is a streamlined permit process across all federal agencies that control land, as well as what we call a shot clock, so that an application doesn't sit on someone's desk or an agency's desk for a long period of time. We need something that says if it's not approved in 90 days or something like that, it's deemed approved. We also have rights-of-way issues with railroads, which obviously the feds can't just wave a magic wand and fix, but that is one issue we face, as well as pole attachments, which are a large hindrance in a number of areas. There are some pole owners that enjoy federal exemption from the FCC pole attachment rules, and make it very expensive to attach their poles to get to some of these areas that need broadband. So those are some of the things that can also hinder the expansion. In my area, Mountain View, we've got down to 5 people per square mile, or 5 households per square mile. So we're very rural, and but we've won some of these Reconnect grants, and we're going out there and doing it.
Yeah, it unfortunately really took something like the pandemic to drive home the fact that there are many areas in my district that were being unserved completely. And you only had to go by the closed McDonald's to see all the people using their broadband in the parking lot to realize just how bad the problem was. Thank you all for being here and communicating. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for allowing me to go. And I yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you, sir. I'll address Mr. Dunn and Ms. Cheney on this. Obviously, there's strong support for providing funding to build out our future networks, but we're also concerned about getting the most out of our limited federal dollars. What protections or conditions should we be placing on funding to ensure that we're really protecting consumers at the same time? For example, from not just on affordability issues, but redlining, abusive data collection practices, as they use networks that the federal government helped build.
Absolutely. So I don't know if someone else is going to go first, but I'll jump in. I mean, absolutely. I think that, this is a time of incredible opportunity, but sometimes in these moments, especially when we're in emergency, we forget to have all of the backstops that we need. And you addressed many of them there. I mean, one of the things that we also want to make sure is that service providers aren't doing any kind of abusive activities as well, inadvertently or intentionally. And so there is a real need to do that, to protect privacy, to make sure that people, when they get on, understand what that means and that, what exposures they are having. And I think one of the things the Latimer plan also talks about is making sure that in our rush to, expand broadband and increase availability and all of the things, that we don't allow communities of color to sort of miss out on the economic opportunity that's happening as well. We want to make sure that as we're setting up all, the funding is going out and we're building that business owners of color are able to access some of that economic opportunity that's being created. It would be a shame to get on the other side of this and to find that we created more gaps than we actually had closed. And I yield the rest, but I think it's very important to be thinking about that as well.
Mr. Dunn?
Mr. Chairman, I would say there are three areas that I would really focus in on. One is on the importance of having enforcement after funds are allocated. We've seen in the past that goalposts have moved, that funding has been given to be able to deliver some quality of broadband to a certain region. That's not actually happened, and then there's a waiver that comes after it, and that sets up a bad dynamic, particularly for those companies that are actually doing the work and not receiving the funding, and then are having to see that someone who doesn't succeed gets it and then is given a waiver. The second area is on data. It is a very strange thing that large incumbents are not required to deliver absolutely up to the moment data on what is available and what isn't. And when there are so many programs, including the RDOF auction that took place recently, that are dependent on that data to show what's served and not served to be able to show accessibility, you ended up with situations where some areas in a place like Pine Bluff, Arkansas, that didn't have broadband access were shown to be served and so couldn't get the money. And some places that were already served but showed as not being served did actually get awarded resources. So there's real importance on making sure that that data is taken care of. Final piece is focusing on future-proof broadband, what Mr. Zimmerman was talking about, which is fiber to the home. You've got to get some emergency resources out there to get people connected in the short term, but for the long-term value and efficiency, you really want to make sure you're bringing fiber to the home. It's the only thing that's future-proof and will allow for scale, since the demand of broadband is projected to increase in terms of upload speeds of 20 to 30% per year. And we just don't want to be here again in 5 years saying we've still got a broadband divide after we've spent billions and billions of dollars on too many short-term solutions.
Thank you both. Mr. Womack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zimmerman, local permitting, licensing issues, environmental, historical preservation reviews, all slow down broadband expansion, as it's already been noted, and makes it more costly. Give us an example as to how you make and how we can make broadband services affordable to those who live in remote areas. And I took note of the fact that you said 5 families per square mile in your rural area. I'd also be curious to know when you do get service out into the areas, is it something that some people decide, well, even though it's here, I don't want it. I'm out here in the rural area for a reason. So what's your experience rate with people hooking up when the service is made available or deciding not to?
Well, that's a really key point. The difference between availability and affordability are very different. And a lot of times someone says, well, they'll say school kids don't have internet at home. Well, there may be internet available right outside their front door, but the cost to subscribe can be prohibitive to the family. So I like to say you can lead a horse to the water, but you can't make him buy a broadband internet. Some people want it, some people got to have it, some people could care less. Our hospital, I'm the chairman of the board of Baxter Regional Hospital. We just did a COVID sign up, and we had to have phone banks. We were going to try and do it all online, but there are too many, especially senior citizens, that do not have an internet connection, or they don't have a computer. They're either they think they're too old to learn, or they just don't want to. And we had to set up a phone bank so people could call in. So people's take rates are much lower than the availability usually.
Mr. Steyer, we've thrown a ton of money at a lot of different things here at the federal government level. And as a former chairman of the Budget Committee, I'm always interested in making sure that we're getting the maximum amount of benefit out of the fewest dollars possible, because I know a lot of this is borrowed money. Most of it's borrowed, maybe all of it's borrowed money that's going on the credit card for our grandkids and our grandkids' to pay. So this question is back to your testimony where you talked about the need maybe for, I think you called it a cross-agency sort of entity. And I'm also enamored with always enamored with the idea of the P3s out there. Whenever you can leverage federal dollars with other money, first of all, it gives us an opportunity to do more with what we have at the federal level, but it also has, when people have skin in the game, they seem to want to make sure that it's done properly and responsibly and that sort of thing. So can you comment on that just a little bit more?
Great, thank you so much. And I think you're 100% right that in essence, there's a collaboration need on multiple levels. There's a collaboration within the federal government itself. You note that there are a whole bunch of entities that are providing financial support for broadband access, but I would broaden the field there and say that it's also about the services themselves that are being provided using that broadband. And we need to see better collaboration on both fronts, because there are ways to generate very large efficiencies if agencies work better together. My view is there's sometimes a tendency to think about restructuring government, trying to build a new agency by putting a bunch together. I think the better investment is actually getting them to work better together. And as you noted, one way of doing that is, the council or OMB, in my view, is an essential actor. You have jurisdiction over OMB, and this is a place where their role as connective tissue is fundamental. Your point on the public-private partnerships, I also think is vital here. So you need collaboration within the federal government. You need it intergovernmentally with the federal, state, and local. And then you need it, obviously, with the government and the private sector. And the more that can be done to encourage it, as you suggest, you get people who are skin in the game, but also knowledge about how to actually make this effective. And then to bring it all around, this point was made earlier, a lot of this is about getting real-time data about what's happening so that you can make sure that resources are being spent right and improving. And that's part of our push on moving the government to pay more attention to customer experience. We need to hear from the customer in order to make sure that the services being provided are actually the ones that are creating the most value for those that need them.
Thank you. I know, Mr. Chairman, my time is up. I'm a big subscriber to the old notion that you measure twice and you cut once to make sure that you're not wasting anything. And if we have another round, I may want to come back with a capacity issue, because I think it would be just a crying shame if we threw all this money at this problem right now, and 5 years from now, we're still talking about this gap that was mentioned earlier. Anyway, again, thanks to all the witnesses. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and to the ranking member as well. Couldn't agree more with the idea of not wasting money and making sure whatever we spend is still going to be effective 5 years from now. And I like that point about fiber optic connections. Mr. Dunn, my questions this morning are for you. We've been talking about the importance of connecting rural places, and I don't think anybody on this call has, this hearing has failed to mention the importance of connecting rural areas. I know the FCC has taken some steps in recent years to work on that problem. In 2018, it conducted Auction 903, allocating Connect America Fund Phase 2 support to certain eligible areas across the United States. At that time, 103 bidders won $1.49 billion over 10 years to provide fixed broadband and voice services to over 700,000 locations in 45 states. In 2020, the FCC adopted the framework for the $20.4 billion Rural Digital Opportunity Fund to bring high-speed fixed broadband service to rural homes and small businesses. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund Phase 1 auction, Auction 904, awarded $9.2 billion over 10 years to service providers that committed to offer voice and broadband services to 5.2 million locations in unserved, high-cost areas. On October 27, 2020, the FCC adopted a report and order establishing the 5G Fund for Rural America, which will make up $9 billion available to up to $9 billion available to bring 5G mobile broadband service to rural areas that would otherwise be unlikely to see deployment of 5G broadband service based upon new mobile coverage data submitted in the FCC's broadband data collection. Two questions I have for you. Number one, can you speak to the adequacy of these efforts and what more the FCC should be doing to ensure broadband is truly universal for millions of Americans living in rural areas? And number two, how do we ensure that additional infrastructure resources that are made available under the American Jobs Act build on rather than duplicate or even adversely affect these ongoing efforts by the FCC?
Mr. Congressman, thank you for that question and the detail. There has been a lot of resources that have put against this really vexing problem over the last 5 years, and most recently the effort of Congress, and now the current FCC is working on getting those data issues handled. Because a lot of the inefficiency of deploying funding to where it could make the most impact in broadband came down to bad maps. And in fact, if you look at some states that went out on their own and did their own maps, like in Georgia, they had the map that was provided by the FCC, and then they did their own ground truthing and found that it was fundamentally different. And when those are then the guidelines for Washington-based deployments of dollars, in a reverse auction or other kinds of mechanism, it means that the funding doesn't necessarily get to the places where it's needed most, or that folks on the ground would know we need resources here to get to the last mile, and not have a situation where a provider might cherry pick. I only want the communities that are in a densely populated area of a rural place. We'll leave everything else to those who are left, whether it's a small telephone company like the one Mr. Zimmerman works with, or it's a municipal entity or anything else. So I would say that the overall problem to be able to solve for the long term is in the neighborhood of $80 to $100 billion over a period of time to really solve fiber to the home in the way that the United States solved rural electrification. Right? It was not a small investment, but it was also about doing something that would have lasting impact and not have us come back later. So I think it's important that we stay focused on that data being accurate and then do resource allocations that focus on the regions and leverage the knowledge of the local providers and the local leadership to get to that last mile. Reverse auctions have a lot of benefits in terms of efficiency, particularly when it comes to something that's more or less ubiquitous, like a wireless spectrum allocation. But it's much tougher when it's being used to give directly to providers to meet the needs of individual residents in a particular census block. So doing allocations like Reconnect, ensuring that there is planning that goes along with it, and that the regions and states are involved in saying, yes, we need these resources to bring future-proof fiber to the last mile is going to be what's critical in delivering that value.
Well, thank you for that answer. And I really like your repeated references to the rural electrification project. That's a reminder to all of us that we can do this, we can get this right. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses again, thank you for being here, for helping us understand this important, very important issue. You know, one thing that's been pointed out here by some of my colleagues, Mr. Womack and others, is that we've spent a boatload of money on this issue, and we should. There's a definite need there, and as people have said, infrastructure has been redefined from what it was in the 70s or 80s, and I don't regret that the federal government has a role here to play. My concern is that as we provide these billions of dollars, and by the way, much of that is to rural parts of our nation, which include, you know, a vast part of my district in rural Utah. I think I represent probably some of the most rural parts of the nation, with the exception maybe Mr. Amadei, who will be speaking here shortly. But and we want to provide those people with the opportunities, and school children and hospitals and others as well. The question that I have, and I guess this is probably for you, Mr. Zimmerman, but I'll allow, you know, would be interested in anyone's input. I'm troubled by recent broadband funding proposals that seem to give preferences to government-owned networks. And I think we see in many cases, you know, there's too many examples where government-owned networks have ultimately failed. You know, and there's an example in my home state of Utah, where iProvo was a government-funded attempt, and it failed fairly miserably. I think there's other examples that we could turn to where government-owned networks, you know, haven't done what they promised to do. And my question is, is there a preference in this government funding? Are we giving a preference to government-owned or government-controlled entities? And should we, or should we allow the market to work on this and for the government to provide adequate funding, but not only give the money to other government-controlled entities who are trying to provide the broadband? And Mr. Zimmerman, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I think that's a great question. Some of the municipal examples around the country have failed spectacularly. You've also seen Google try to go in and put fiber in different cities like Kansas City and pull out. It's a hard thing to do. It's a expensive and hard thing to do. And I think some of the municipalities have done it based on unreasonable take rates, which that has killed a lot of projects. You can build it, but you can't make people pay for it. I think one of the key things is in the past, some of these things like CAF2 funding or RDOF have been based on very low broadband speed minimums, and they've been asynchronous, as in 25-3, 25 down and 3 up. I think any kind of funding you do for any kind of government plan should be 100 by 100. It should be 100 up, 100 down. And that will help make some of these investments go to fiber networks, which are the only networks that can reasonably handle that speed and can reasonably be upgraded to them. We've had some things where some of the wireless wins have been because they want it like 25.3. They're good at sending stuff down to you, but they can't send stuff up to you. And the reason that upload speed is important to you, you've got things like home security networks. You've got people working from home. You've got kids playing games, and there's a lot of data going both ways. So if you guys could make sure government plans require 100 by 100 minimum for bids, it will direct more of the money to a fiber-based system that is what we call future-proof. So I think Mr. Dunn mentioned the speeds and how much they're progressing. Right now, the average U.S. fixed broadband speed is 179 down by 65 up. But
hey, Mr. Zimmerman.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt you because I only have a minute left.
Yes, sir.
And I appreciate your comments on the speeds, and I don't discount that at all. But in the few seconds I have left, I want to reemphasize that once again, this principle that I think you agreed with me, and that is the government has a responsibility in some cases to help fund these organizations, but I don't think we should defer to government entities in order to provide the service. I think the market can do that much more efficiently. Just a yes or no, do you agree with that? Completely?
Absolutely. We're boots on the ground. We know where things need to go.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll conclude in the last 16 seconds I have with just an observation, and that is we often hear of the urgency, but local permitting, licensing issues, environmental concerns, historical preservation, there's so many obstacles are placed in the way, and I would look forward to a regulatory review as well, so that we don't deny people access while we go through a 7-year historical review. That's got to be part of this as well. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pocan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. So this is an interesting conversation, and I come at this from a bit of a different perspective, but a very similar background as Mr. Stewart. I have a lot of very rural parts of my district. One of my counties, the growing population is Amish. Just to give you an idea, I live in a rural town of 850 or so people. There's no town center, there's a town hall. I first got broadband 3 years ago. Prior to that, I got the half price sale on a dish for $300 a month for 40 measured gigs a month, and about an hour on Netflix is 2.5 gig. I make $174,000. I could kind of afford it. Most people couldn't. So here's where I'm at, and I help form a rural broadband caucus, a bipartisan around this. I am very curious. To me, when we all say it's like water, electricity, I want to ask, why don't we really mean that? If we really mean that, wouldn't that argue that we would put this under Title II so that it would regulate it like a common carrier and provide greater access to people rather than the system that we currently have, where like my town had to wait until the one company got free money to put it into my town because we had a state law that didn't allow co-ops or local communities to do this. And I know, Mr. Dunn, you brought that up specifically. Point number 3, I heard what you said. So my question to Mr. Dunn and Ms. Cheney specifically is around, what about this idea about Title II and what else? Because I'm kind of tired of the conversation about, I'm sorry, when Mr. Zimmerman, you said some people couldn't care less about broadband. I call that at my BS meter, right? Even my 92-year-old mother who doesn't work on a computer talks through her Alexa, right? And without that, she's not, getting the weather or the joke of the day. So Mr. Dunn, Ms. Cheney, if you could just address the Title II question and then the question about cooperatives and munis and others, how do we really get this done? Because I feel like we say water and electricity, but we don't mean it. Ms. Cheney, you want to go first? I see you smiling.
Sure. I'm smiling in part because, the Urban League, we're not really focused on, what section it comes out of, or frankly, whether or not you focus on municipalities or whether it's, we let the market handle it. The truth is, we think that in some places it works for there to be municipal governments who are in on creating a system, and in some places it would not work, right? And it would be a failure. So both can happen. We want to make sure that we don't have any bars to doing any of it, because ultimately we want what works in order to get people broadband. I
So you're
also
kind of-
agree with you. Just really quickly, I smiled because I agree with you. Everyone wants broadband. I've heard this argument that there's someone who doesn't want it. But yes, that might be true for a small group. Vast majorities of people want it. And if they knew what it would get them, they would even want it more. So I think we have to let some of that go. It's a fantasy.
Mr. Dunn, let me just add this one sentence. We also have the second most expensive broadband on the planet. So if you could address my questions in that regard too.
So there's a couple of directions that you go. Before you get to Title II and needing to create it as a regulated monopoly, I think there is a number of steps that can be taken on ensuring that there's more active participation. And the biggest one that I mentioned before is predicating the next tranche of federal funding, and there should be, because now is the moment, on states adopting laws that allow for public-private partnerships, including with municipalities and cooperatives. It seems crazy that there would be actual state laws preventing the same entities that allowed electricity come to rural places to prevent the electricity of our time. So that's where I would just emphasize the focus and the effort right now. If that still isn't sufficient, when you have the plans in place and you have a commitment to getting to the last mile of those communities, then starting to explore that next step, I think makes sense. The cost factor actually has to do with structures that allow for competition. And competition, where it makes sense, does help in driving down costs. In Europe, they have a different model, which is the common ownership of the actual infrastructure, and then ISPs can provide and they compete with each other on pricing. That's a very different model than we've adopted in the US, and shifting to that would be challenging. But what we have seen is that in places where there are multiple providers, where we're fortunate enough, not in rural places where it doesn't really make sense for multiple providers most of the time, but where there is, you see prices go down.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Kirkpatrick, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today to discuss these important issues. I represent a district in Southern Arizona. However, as Arizona's only representative on the Appropriation Committee, I see it as my responsibility to advocate for the whole state. As you probably know, Arizona has strong Native American communities, including a number of tribal colleges throughout the state. These tribal colleges provide critical higher education opportunities to significantly underserved areas. That's why I was proud that the fiscal year 21 Consolidated Appropriations Bill included $285 million to create a new Office of Minority Broadband Initiatives at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration that will support minority serving institutions, including tribal colleges and universities. So I only have time for one question because I have to jump onto another committee, but my first question to any of our witnesses who feel comfortable responding, can you talk about some of the unique challenges tribal colleges and universities face when it comes to broadband connectivity, both for students on and off campus? And given these challenges, how important is it that we continue to ensure tribal colleges and universities, as well as Native American communities more broadly, are given specific allocations for broadband deployment?
I'm happy to take a first stab at this. And Congresswoman, thank you for bringing up this important category of communities, if you want to put it that way. I can't speak as specifically to tribal colleges and universities, although they face, since many of them are in rural places, they face the same challenges of being able to get broadband deployment as most other rural colleges and universities. But what I will say is that when indigenous or tribal college students go home, their situation is usually quite challenging. As we know, tribal communities are very different across the country, whether they're living in reservations or they're actually in other kinds of setups in other parts of the country. And so it can vary dramatically how remote, how much challenge there is for getting connectivity there, and then how much of a challenge it is to get it to individual homes. And in some cases, pueblos and others are incredibly remote and don't have the intermediate infrastructure to be even able to get that kind of connectivity there. So I would just say that it's really, really important for indigenous and tribal communities to be able to get additional resources, to get that middle mile infrastructure and then get full deployment to make sure that they're on equal footing, since not everyone learns while they're on campus at a university or college. And that's certainly true for tribal universities and college. You want to make sure that they have access to that connectivity at home and to close that homework gap and make sure that there's real connectivity throughout those regions serving our tribal communities.
Congresswoman, our Latimer plan actually does speak directly to tribal colleges, and one of the things, and tribal communities, one of the things we've done is we have endorsed the digital equity and inclusion bill, because we think there should be plans that are created at the state and local level and at the tribal level for ensuring broadband and digital inclusion in those spaces. And another thing we ask for and call for is that universities are used as digital navigators to make sure they are actually helping their communities, whoever they serve, HBCUs, Hispanic serving institutions, Asian American serving institutions, and tribal colleges and universities, to make sure that they are being utilized and getting the resources that will help them, but also helping their communities, so that both students, when they go back home, but also their families, have greater access to broadband. I will follow up with your staff to make sure that they know what we've said about tribal communities.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ms. Torres, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this meeting, and thank you to our panel for staying this long. Mr. Zimmerman, a reliable internet connection has always been important, but it became especially vital, as you have heard throughout the hearing, during the pandemic, when it became necessary to work from home, remote school, or even just seeing and continuing to be engaged with our loved ones. My constituents face repeated outages, which have made it very difficult to do any of those things. But more important than even all of that is a concern that I have regarding access to 911 during outages. As you know, telephone providers have moved to voice over the internet. Many of those companies, although it's the law that they are supposed to admonish their customers that should there be an outage, they could not have, or they may not have access to 911 services. The seniors in my community are very concerned about this issue because many of them are dependent on panic alarms, on being able to dial 911 when they have an emergency. And when outages occur, none of that could happen. So what steps have you taken to increase your ability to respond to outages? And as we think about providing additional funding for broadband, are there additional regulations or guidelines that should be in place to improve reliability in the mindset of emergency services availability and response?
Yes, it'd be nice to say we go back to the good old days on landline. You used to send electricity down the landline, and that's how, if the power's out, your phone still works, and you can call 911 even if the power's out. So the current VoIP, so if you dial 911 and it goes over a voice over internet circuit, if the power goes out and if you don't have enough battery backup, then yes, the power can die. What is required is for network providers, which is what we do here at Yellcat, is we have different routes out. If the fiber gets cut over on the east side of town, we can reroute it to the west side of town. That does cost money to make what are called alternate routes. So that is an added expense to the network provider, but it is something you can require to make sure that 911 does not get cut. So that way you can have alternate routes to 911. They call it PSAP, where the 911 calls are answered.
I was a 911 dispatcher for 17 and a half years. So I'm, I know very intimately, the subject and the hardships, that occurs. Part of my district is a concrete jungle. The other part, is wanting to be that, but not quite yet. It is a suburb of Los Angeles. However, the internet challenges are still there. There is this redlining that has been brought out by some of my other colleagues. The fact that internet providers are not investing in communities like mine because they don't see the return for their investment. So I think it is a responsibility of, when that doesn't happen, for the federal government to step in and help improve conditions, not just for quality of life issues, for convenience, but for commerce and for emergency services. So I wonder, Ms. Cheney, do you have anything to add on this issue?
Sorry, say it one more time. I cut off a little bit and wasn't able to hear you fully. I apologize.
Reliability for internet, the lack of investment from internet providers in communities, the working poor, the redlining, that we continue to see. It's so obvious, and the responsibility of the federal government to ensure that we have that we are responding to the need of all of our constituents.
That's right. I mean, I'm so glad that you brought that up. I mean, one of the things that we talk about in the plan is that, I mean, we talked a lot in this hearing today, are talking a lot about availability, and that's important. But we also have to talk about affordability and what's been happening in communities where they have broadband all around them, right? But they can't access it because they can't afford it. Or they have broadband in areas that are near them, right? But not necessarily, they're sort of in a desert in the middle of all of this access. So yeah, we have to have greater controls over that, greater accountability. And one of the things we're concerned about is making sure that as we're making these much needed generational investments, we aren't doing it in a way that over enriches companies without putting any kind of, limits on them in a way, or guardrails or regulations that make sure that they, are actually doing what we're investing for them to do. So we agree, completely.
Thank you. My time is up. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Bishop.
Did you say Bishop?
Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me thank the witnesses for being here, and let me offer my apologies. I had another commitment earlier in the hearing, and so I apologize if I become redundant in my questions. Let me ask Ms. Cheney, your organization recently released a comprehensive plan discussing the challenges facing low-income areas and communities of color It notes that in order to address the gap in availability, we have to prioritize producing an accurate map of broadband availability that pinpoints those unserved by broadband services. The need for accurate maps is something that we recognize in Georgia. The Cyber Arch program at the University of Georgia created a statewide map that allows us to identify broadband dead zones down to single addresses. Can you speak to the importance of updating the FCC's broadband maps and how we can use updated maps to guide our policymaking?
Absolutely. I mean, yes, we absolutely call for updated maps. But the thing is, we've been calling for updated maps. So many have been calling for them for quite a long time. One of the things that I think hopefully the other witnesses will agree is that we need to have some public-private partnerships here. It's not just the FCC, there are other government agencies that have maps or information that we can use to have improved understanding of where we need service. And where that strength of that service is. There are also private institutions, private companies who have information to this data. They're not relying on old maps and materials to make their investments. Yeah, we should be coming together and figuring out.
Doesn't have good broadband. Like one of the
Thank
hearings
you.
we had.
Okay, thank you so much. Someone else chimed in.
To participate, they need to ask me a question.
Ms. Cheney, you recently released a comprehensive plan that identified principal barriers to achieving digital equity and inclusion, and one of those is affordability. And of course, in our appropriations bill last year, Congress allocated $3.2 billion for an emergency broadband benefit program to connect low-income households. The funds are used to subsidize broadband costs up to $50 a month per low-income household. While it's clearly in the early implementation, do you believe that the EBB program is properly targeted to help close the affordability gap, and should we make this program permanent?
I definitely think we need to make the program permanent. I definitely think we need to learn the lessons from this current rollout. So, we'll know more, right, about how well it's doing, where it's targeted, what needs to be adjusted as we go through the program. But I think that the good outweighs, whatever concerns we might have, including about the cost is so essential. The vast majority of people who are not, engaged in broadband, who have it available to them, right? It's not so much the vast majority of people who don't have broadband. Actually, it's not that they don't have it available; they can't afford it. Mm-hmm. And so we want to make sure that we hone in on that. We definitely want to focus on availability. It's the first part of our plan. But if we do that and we don't deal with the fact that the majority of people who don't have broadband simply don't have it because they can't meet the financial requirements, we'll still be here, not just 5 or 10 years from now, we'll be here next year talking about this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Zimmerman, since the FCC announced the winning bidders in round 1 of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund reverse auction, many have voiced concerns over the ability of certain providers to perform as promised. For example, I've heard from local broadband providers that their bids were undercut by large national providers at price points that they believed could not be met. What guardrails can we implement to ensure that winning bidders perform as promised and allow local providers the same opportunity to meet the needs of our constituents?
That's a really good question. My company bid on some areas and won a small bit, but we lost some to some very, very low bids. And there are concerns about the technology that was proposed in these bids. The FCC is currently looking through the long form applications that these companies made to prove their capabilities. We would prefer that bidders on anything like this have to prove their bona fides before they bid rather than afterwards. You don't want to give out this money based on someone's hopes and dreams that this one weird radio frequency might just work when it might not. So we prefer that people be vetted up front about their technological capabilities rather than getting awarded and 5 years later we find out they couldn't do it.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. I think my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are you back?
Thank you. Mr. Womack, have we heard from everyone on your side as well?
I believe we have, Mr. Chairman.
Now, I know
Mr.
that you had sort of a hanging question at the end of yours. We are not going to go through a whole nother second round, but in lieu perhaps of, you have a right to close anyway. If you wanted to finish up with that question,
Sure.
that would be just
one
fine.
quick question. And since Mark Amadei hasn't taken any questions, asked any questions today, and instead has had a good staff
You're
call.
channeling your inner Mr. Amadei.
Yeah, well,
Good luck
and
with
now
that.
he's awake. Let me.
Hey, can I say something, Mr. Ranking Member? You gut shooter?
Oh, please do.
That's all I wanted to say. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
There you go. Look, here's the remaining question. And this, maybe it fits in the capacity question. I don't know, but I'm going to ask this. Hearing proposals to open up broadband for 100 service, but we still have communities that don't have the basic, even the most basic 25.3 service. So Lang, what do you believe the proposals that we're hearing now about 100 would hurt communities? Obviously, there's a competition for funding that still don't even have basic broadband.
I don't think so. I think you need to start focusing money so it gets put into future-proof networks, which fiber is the one that can do what's needed in the future. If you do it based on 10.1 or if you do it based on 25.3, you will be in the position in 10 years from now where capacity needs are going to keep going up 20% a year, and that you'll have to be in the same position to rebuild it. If you go ahead and do it, and I think several of the other panelists have said, you need to make it so you don't come back here and be in the same position in 5 years, and you need to require something that can be upgraded.
Mr. Dunn, I see an affirmative nod from you. I assume you are in agreement.
Absolutely. And I don't want to say that there is a lack of concern for the immediate needs, and there really are some immediate needs. Some of those can be solved with hotspots and other kinds of things on the short term, and even some wireless to be able to do it. But to Mr. Zimmerman's point, if we really want to be thinking the long term and making sure that there is going to be equal access and the most efficient use of funds over that long term, it's got to be 100 over 100 and fiber to the home.
You can
Mr.
also,
Chairman, look, go ahead, Lane.
I would say you need to also prioritize the areas that have the worst service. These areas you're talking about with nothing, start there first and build out from there. Don't go back into areas that already have it.
Agreed.
Yeah, makes sense.
National Urban League agrees with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this has been a really enlightening hearing. And as I said in my opening remarks, a bipartisan subject on broadband. So thanks to the witnesses for all being here. And Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back my time.
Thank you. I agree. Everyone gets a note home that they all have worked and played well with others. And I appreciate the time and the work that all of our witnesses do on an ongoing basis. So we appreciate everyone's involvement. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.